So neurons need to communicate with one another, and it occurs at the synapse. Most of our synapses are what are called chemical synapses, where neurotransmitters are released into the space between two neurons. So chemical synapses would be neurotransmitters released into the space between neurons. So this chemical energy then has to be converted back to electrical energy. So it goes from electrical energy as the action potential is passed down the axon, the release of the neurotransmitters have to diffuse across the synapse, and then they bind to receptors on the next neuron, and that next neuron then sends or changes that chemical energy into an electrical energy again. So when we look at this space, we have what is called the presynaptic neuron, and it is connecting to the postsynaptic neuron. And so these neurons are arranged in chains. So they connect to one another. One neuron, however, could be synapsed with hundreds of other neurons. So it's more like a network of this. So this is the space. So the presynaptic neuron releases neurotransmitters, and we're going to talk about how that happens. And then they move across, and then the neurotransmitters bind to receptors on the dendrites. So what releases the neurotransmitters? That would be the axonal terminal. So we'll put caveat here. Axonal terminal releases neurotransmitters. Okay, so let's look at a diagram of this. So this is here my presynaptic neuron. Notice that the electrical energy, the action potential, is only traveling in one direction. And it is going to travel to the ends of these axons. And in the ends of the axons, we're going to have the release of neurotransmitters. So what happens? The steps. So we can talk about the steps. So first, an action potential reaches the end of the axon. 2, calcium ions, calcium again. Remember we talked about the importance of calcium in muscles? Calcium ions move in to the neuron. 3, the neurotransmitters are released into the synapse. And in this particular instance, the neurotransmitter you can see is in these vesicles. So these are little packets of neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are red, the calcium ions are purple, and these neurotransmitters are going to be released into the space, the synapse between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. They diffuse across, and then here you can see in this particular instance, they're binding to these sodium ion channels. So the binding of the neuron can change the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so I'm going to write that as number 4, but I'm going to write it on another page. So number 4 would be the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse, and bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So what do they do? What do these neurotransmitters do? Well, it depends upon the type of neurotransmitter, and it also depends upon the receptor, which is interesting. We have two types of neurotransmitters in general. The first type is excitatory. So this increases the probability that an action potential will be generated. So it moves that membrane potential towards the threshold. What's an example of an excitatory? We've already talked about one when we talked about the muscles. Acetylcholine is an excitatory when it is with the when it's released by motor neurons innervating muscle fibers. When we talk about the brain, we might also talk about dopamine. Dopamine is excitatory. It causes more action potentials to be generated, and it's a really important mood, like having the ability to just kind of do stuff, right? Dopamine levels are important. We also have inhibitory neurotransmitters that actually decrease the likelihood that an action potential will be generated. So let's talk about these inhibitory neurotransmitters. So these decrease the likelihood, and that's an I. Oh, sorry, let's spell that again. We'll put probability, that might be better. The probability that an action potential will be generated. What is an example of one that you might have heard of? An example would have been serotonin. So serotonin actually tends to calm the nervous system, even though it is used for depression related to anxiety. It makes you less anxious, so you feel like you are able to do more things. So serotonin is an important inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. Okay, so let's look at summary again. Okay. So this is my synapse. This chemical energy in the form of the neurotransmitter diffuses across the synapse. And these neurotransmitters also have to, if they stay in the synapse, it can be a problem. So they can be broken down, they can diffuse away, they can be taken back up by the neuron that released them. So we want those neurotransmitters not to stay in the synapse for an extended period of time. And some of the drugs that we take affect that, the amount of neurotransmitters in the synapse. So, for example, antidepressants are SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So it keeps serotonin in the synapse longer than normal. Okay, so this is a summary of how one neuron can communicate with another neuron. So the presynaptic neuron communicating with the postsynaptic neuron.